This lecture will look at the next generation from 1995 to 2000, really starting with the console wars launched by Sega in competition with Nintendo. Now, with Nintendo, a theme will present itself as it will rely on its successful hardware and software long after its competitors launch the next generation. At this time, we know that Nintendo did begin looking at a successor system, but the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was performing very well in the marketplace. Therefore, they continue to support it long after the others are going to enter the foray, such as Sega. At the same time, the PC engine was developed by Hudson Soft and NEC, launching the 16-bit era of home consoles with its named PC engine. Now, this had a dual 16-bit GPU, allowing for 512 colors to be displayed. That was 10 times that seen on the NES and other systems. Now, we find that the PC Engine did find success in Japan, and it was ready for an international release. However, Sega was ready at this point and entered the market. In fact, Sega's R&D team, led by Masami Ishikawa, had been working on the next console ever since the Master System. Now, the arcade side of the business had paid off at this point, finally, for Sega after a disastrous foray previously discussed. The 16-bit arcade board now was feasible thanks to the falling microprocessor prices, and now that could be adapted for a new home console design. The new Master System, or renamed Sega Genesis for copyright purposes, would now be able to play arcade-perfect versions at home of what Sega previously only had their single console units for in the arcade. Games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, and Shinobi now made possible in a home console. Now, the Mark V had been in development and changed to Mega Drive in the Japanese market, launching in 1988 with 400,000 in sales. As mentioned, once they began to release in the American market, they changed it for Sega Genesis for legal reasons. Now, this outsold the Japan PC Engine and Super Nintendo, or SNES. But the main target was, of course, America. So while they did not perform as well in Japan, they would go neck and neck with Nintendo in the US market. The success of entering this market can be largely thanks to Mike Katz, who was at the time president of Atari's entertainment division and was hired on as Sega of America's CEO. Now, he came up with the slogan that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and had a very interesting TV commercial with the chorus, "You can't do this on Nintendo," with professional athletes, with, of course, a roaring soundtrack, and Michael Jackson even at the time. So this, at the moment, redefined Sega as a cool video game company, as opposed to Nintendo's rather family-friendly image, and Genesis would exploit this perception again and again. This laid the foundations for Sega's success in America, stigmatizing Nintendo as a company that made children's games. Now, Katz also solved the software problem, since Nintendo had a stranglehold on developers. He, instead inspired by Electronic Arts' adoption of real-world personalities, would sign up professional athletes like Joe Montana for football, Pat Riley for golf, and Evander Holyfield for boxing. Thus, we have a large library now of software, and it lent an instant credibility to Sega's brand. Now, we find that after the launch, the Sega Genesis did sell 500,000 units, but that was not enough for the president back in Japan, so Katz would be replaced. Katz's replacement would be Tom Kalinske, who would cut prices immediately and lure developers away from Nintendo, also at the same time ramping up advertising. The first thing he also decided that needed to happen was they needed to replace Altered Beast, which would be the selection or the built-in title for Sega Genesis buyers. They needed to replace that with their own original character. Now we know that Altered Beast was designed for the Sega System 16 board as a title that could be used both on the arcade and the console format and platformer. So it was a side-scrolling action game where the player's centurion, seen in the lower right, would change into various beasts with these power-ups, these orbs that are rotating here. Now, the best features of the games were the combination of these large sprites you see around and the inspired enemy designs. However, it was designed to showcase the visuals of what the new hardware could do with Sega, but the action was actually quite lacking and abysmal. Now, as mentioned before, there were several Mario clones in the 1980s and 1990s, the de facto mascot for Nintendo. Clones like Buzzbee, Zool, and Cool Spot, as seen here, were largely lacking in visual design and accompanied by poor games to boot. So, in order to develop an original character for Sega, they turned to Naoto Oshima, who would design Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. He was an AM8 development team member who was ordered to create this character to fill the role of Sega's console mascot. And it was born out of the idea of unique gameplay, very unlike that of Mario for Nintendo. So the programmer, Yuji Naka, created a tech demo featuring a sprite, that being this character, a nondescript character that moved very smoothly on a curve. This became the prototype of a speedy character moving through a winding tube. This would require the adoption of an animal that could roll into a ball. So Oshima designed Sonic the Hedgehog with the additional added benefits of spikes for attacking, a genius move. Of course, they're not very fast, but the physics worked with this particular animal. The development of Sonic, in fact, was a development away from the Mario paradigm. Naka would look at the fundamentals when designing Sonic the Hedgehog and consider what made Mario a good game and good character. He surmised that it was the fluid movement that was achieved with just the D-pad and 2 buttons. He also noted that the level structures unfortunately stopped Mario in full flow, forcing players to work their way up vertical platforms, bashing bricks, or entering a pipe. It is in fact impossible to move through a level as they originally designed in Super Mario Bros. In less than 30 seconds. Therefore, even experienced players had to take the same amount of time. The innovation Naka found with Sonic the Hedgehog, released in 1991, was that if you're better at the game and more experienced, you should be able to clear stages more quickly. And that's exactly what Sonic allows the player to do. It pushed the speed factor, and thus it felt very different from Mario, with much more fluid movements, as Sonic rushed through these levels, turning into a ball and collecting rings. The stunning visuals and brightly colored sprites moving at high speeds were not on any other console. This was unique, and thus it is a new take on the 2D platformer. Now, the stages could be raced through initially with tricks for experienced players, and vertical expanses could also be explored. However, the interactive environmental features like the loop-de-loops which are fun to trigger, and the power-ups that litter the landscape make every stage different and interesting, allowing for multiple playthroughs. And you would miss these qualities and these little hidden secrets if you merely ran through it as fast as possible. Therefore, it is playable on several different levels. Now, it was a simple and charming world designed by Naka, where badnik enemies litter it, and Dr. Robotnik would come up at the end of each stage and the end of each world with a diabolical new boss, usually associated with some type of robot or mechanical being. Now, Kalinsky would make Sonic the Hedgehog the new pack-in title for the Genesis, selling it for $129. Now, the cool factor is what made Sega popular and struck the first blow in the console wars, outselling Nintendo's SNES or Super Nintendo 2-1 at the time in the American market. Nintendo waited on the sidelines as the PC Engine and Mega Drive, or Genesis, entered the 16-bit race. They were unwilling to leave their lucrative NES behind, as it was still very popular. Nintendo was at the same time developing the new Super Nintendo system. Masayuki Uemura would be the developer and the designer for this new system, which was called the Famicom for the family computer, and that was a shortened version of it. They were launched at a fevered pitch in Japan, selling 300,000 units in a mere hours. Now, the success of what is known in America as the SNES, or Super Nintendo Entertainment System, lay not in hardware design improvements very dramatically, but instead on the refinement of beloved earlier games like Super Mario Brothers or Zelda. It launched, in fact, with Super Mario World. Now, Super Mario Bros. 3 was a giant leap in the series for Nintendo, but Super Mario World can be understood instead as a refinement of that. A commensurately superior set of visuals accompanied the game, and is considered one of the best 2D games ever made. Now, the main innovation for Super Mario World was Yoshi, a rideable green dinosaur that would gulp up enemies in front of him, as Mario could also fly with him. The levels in Super Mario World were a collection of clockwork obstacle courses designed to confuse players and delight them in equal measure with the playful nature of them. There's an open structure now to the world and the map which is familiar, but it's more polished at this point. It connects everything together in one long sequence of bobbing landmarks, which allows for replaying levels in order to find secret exits and hiding even more in the minutiae of the game design and mechanics. The success of Super Mario 3 meant that Nintendo did not need to reinvent the wheel. Instead, they simply built the best game that was possible at the time. The intricacy of the game can be seen in the ghost houses that were fiendishly toying with players as they hid solutions. Here's the example of the ghost from Mario 3 on the left and Super Mario World on the right. Another example would be Star Road, which was a group of secret levels found by dedicating a lot of time, and it was extremely challenging to get there. But once you did, at the end, it would spell out in coins, you are a super player. Thus, of course, there are multiple ways in which to enjoy the game. Unlike the myriad of power-ups seen in Super Mario 3, here in Super Mario World, Nintendo decided to pare back these power-ups, concentrating instead on the power of the feather, that in this case granted Mario a cape, much like the raccoon suit, allowing him to fly. But after running out of steam, he could then dive bomb towards the ground or hold the cape like a parachute. Thus, alternating between the two modes would let Mario hang glide. The most unusual aspect of Super Mario World, in contrast to Sonic, is that it is not designed to show what the hardware can do. Instead, technical prowess takes a back seat to perfecting the game itself. One reason why Sonic made such an impact as it did was because of this brash technical showcase of what the hardware in this new 16-bit system could do. Instead, Super Mario World looked more like the same, only prettier, more refined. Now, whereas Super Mario World was a better game, Nintendo was now learning that software was no longer everything, seeing the successes of the Genesis and Sega sold along with it. The NES made Nintendo complacent, they realized, and they underestimated Sega and their third-party publishers. Regardless, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was a hit from the start, selling 4 million in the first year in Japan alone in its release in 1991. Now, it was released in North America after that in Japan, and typical for Nintendo, they waited another year until they released in Europe. Now, it was launched with Super Mario World as a pack-in title. Nintendo, however, no longer held a monopoly on third-party developers like Electronic Arts. Sega now drove home this advantage by establishing the Sega Technical Institute, or STI, in San Francisco in 1991. Now, this would be a developer dedicated to making games that would appeal to the US market and would import stars like Yuji Naka that we just discussed. Now, Sega Technical Institute would produce hits like Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which would add Tails and a further refinement to the series in 1992. The same year, they would also produce Kid Chameleon, which was designed to compete with Mega Man for Nintendo. And they also came up with oddities like the Ooze of 1995. Now, what Sega, and especially the Technical Institute associated with the brand, came to be known for is crafting offbeat icons. One of the finest examples of this, and a brutally difficult 2D beat-em-up game, would be Comic Zone, produced by and designed by Sega Technical Institute. It was distinguished by its original concept and presentation. It featured an illustrator, Sketch Turner, who was sucked into his own work, and the game takes place over a series of panels, creating the effect of being inside a comic book. Now, we find that you can bash through panels to find alternate routes, much like the secret routes in Mario or in Sonic, for instance. Now, we find that there has been no game since that mimicked this winning concept. It was too original. Another great example, and one of the console's finest, would be Herzog 2 of 1990 that combined a real-time strategy game where players would maneuver units or structures and involved shooter mechanics. The player controls a flying mecha that would allow you to purchase, deploy, and also give orders to ground combat units. The AI in the game is actually limited, but the multiplayer experience is excellent thanks to the very deep mechanics built into the game. Now, the production bases have to be controlled in the game in order to keep one's army supplied, and thus, of course, the real-time strategy comes into play. The position of the mecha on the map is crucial in the game and had an enormous influence on games like Dune 2 of 1992, which was considered the true starting point of RTS games, seen in the lower right-hand corner here. Now, Sega had a knack for finding offbeat titles and tried to establish a niche where Nintendo was family-friendly and had a stable of well-known characters and games. Sega would find something new and original. The best offbeat title would actually be these hippie aliens that were trapped on Earth, Toe Jam and Earl, designed by Johnson Vorsanger Productions in 1991. Now, the aliens would attempt to escape by finding 10 spaceship parts while being pursued by various nightmarish Earthlings, which were really nerds, or ghostly ice cream trucks, chickens armed with tomato mortars, a very surreal and idiotic almost kind of presentation. So this surreal aesthetic combined with a roguelike structure, which would randomize levels in every game, so no two games were the same. Thus, of course, it's going to be infinitely replayable. Now, there is care and attention paid to this world, making it a classic. In two-player mode, the aliens would chat and bicker with each other, and you could, of course, split apart, and the screen would divide in two in split-screen mode, and would come back together when Toe Jam and Earl were close to one another again. The surreal aesthetic, of course, would add to this element and would make it infinitely replayable. This does not mean, of course, that Nintendo didn't also have its technical showcases. The F-Zero, designed by Miyamoto in 1990, is one such example of a futuristic racer created for the launch of the console to demonstrate what Mode 7 ability could do. And Mode 7, for the Super Nintendo, would rotate and scale backgrounds to create a pseudo three-dimensional environment. The blisteringly fast game F-Zero, this racer, had tough AI opponents. The tracks were filled with hairpin bends that test the player's skills, and showcased the sweetly gaudy visuals at incredible speeds, at least for the time. Another game designed to be a technical showcase was actually cooperatively designed by British Argonaut Games, and they came up with the Super FX chip in 1993. Now this chip would improve the capabilities of the SNES through a cartridge-held coprocessor called the Super FX chip, seen here in the upper section of the screen. This allowed the hardware to render polygons and advance two-dimensional effects, as seen here. The first game to take advantage of the FX chip was Star Fox, designed again by Miyamoto in 1993. Now this had the chip that was co-developed by the British Argonaut Company and Nintendo, where the player would pilot an R-Wing assault ship in a three-dimensional on-the-rails shooter, snaffling up power-ups and blasting enemies while at the same time dodging obstacles. The polygonal visuals were the defining kind of visual format for the 16-bit era. Now, the achievement here is matched by the outstanding soundtrack included by Miyamoto. Now, Nintendo's touch, of course, were the space pilots in this universe were talking animals, including Fox McCloud, Peppy Hare, and Falco Lombardi. The multiple routes that one could take in Star Fox also ensured enormous replay value, which is very important for any home console title. The SNES is so beloved, unlike Sega, not so much for its technical showcases and prowess, but instead for its spectacular versions of beloved classics and the blooming JRPG genre, or Japanese role-playing game genre. This is seen nowhere more than in the Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, again by Miyamoto and launched in 1991. Now, whereas Super Mario World refined the 2D platformer to near perfection, Zelda did the same thing for action RPGs. Now, it is cited also as one of the greatest games ever made. Now, it abandoned the side-on combat in favor of an angled top-down two-dimensional experience seen in the lower section here. The major difference with Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is the atmosphere that Miyamoto includes. The game begins on a dark and stormy night with Link waking to see his uncle. His uncle warns him to stay in bed, but of course Link soon leaves immediately after his uncle does, hopping out of bed, leaving his house and entering a world that's dashed with rain and filled with worried soldiers. We find a route here into the castle's basement where his dying uncle bequeaths a sword and shield to the boy. The greatest achievement of this version of Zelda: A Link to the Past is a combination of overworld dungeons and the structure that gently guides the player between them. The world of Hyrule here has many elements where you have a large town filled with NPCs or non-player characters. It has mini games, it has odd little cabins, and there are secrets dotted around this world. The dungeons here are constructed around one of the game's items for each one. At first, progress is painstakingly slow until the player acquires a map and a compass. They are unable to face the dungeon's challenges. The turning point, of course, is when these are found and a mid-boss is defeated. Thereby, new capabilities feed into previously unsolvable challenges. The second half of any dungeon now speeds up in pacing dramatically. There is a magnificent twist here, for after completing the first of 3 dungeons, Link is banished by Aghanim into the Dark World, a warped version of Hyrule, where the ultimate villain Ganondorf is imprisoned. The game continues with Link completing 7 dungeons in the Dark World, warping back and forth between the 2 settings, solving mysteries across boundaries in both of them. This codified the structure of Zelda games moving forward, and anytime in the future we have a new version. It introduced the multi-level dungeon idea, correspondingly with fiendish puzzles, forcing the player to think in 3 dimensions. And there's also a dual world structure that is commonplace from hereafter. Now, the huge world doubled in size with the dark twist. Hence, we have this alternate version of the universe and twice as much to play, capturing the sense of exploration and mystery with the series. Turning back to Gunpei Yokoi, his Metroid was originally designed in 1986 and released on the NES. And as with Zelda and Mario, Super Metroid upgraded the original one designed by Yokoi and returned to the first game in the series for a further refinement. Here you have the original on the left and the Super Nintendo version on the right. The narrative in this is lurid, energy-sucking aliens and space pirates dotting this 2D scroller. Now here we find that it keeps the focus on the environment and the character's player here, which is Samus. The real story, in fact, is how Samus's abilities increase throughout the game. Zebes is actually the main location for Super Metroid, where this drama plays out. In fact, it is an enormous two-dimensional maze, with most of the routes initially blocked until certain items are acquired, much like we just discussed with Zelda. Now, as Samus becomes more capable, the planet begins to open up for exploration. At first, these closed doors are very frustrating until the player realizes that they will come back later to open them. Now, there is an intangible pleasure as well with Super Metroid in that, along with the on-screen map, the player is keeping a mental map to complement it, where you would note the items that you need to come back for to help open these blocked ways. This delivers as a player comes back as a buffed up and beefed up Samus with these new abilities. Thus, of course, it has two realms of play in this instance. For the first round, much like Zelda, is slow and frustrating, and then once you collect all these items, the gratification is going to kick in as you can go back and accomplish what you were not able to before. Now, there's also a subgenre of Metroidvania, which is a portmanteau, which is a combination of meanings of the games in the series of Metroid and Castlevania. So we already know that Metroid is set within this space-like environment with aliens. On the other hand, Castlevania has gothic castles and vampires, as seen here in the lower right. So in the upper left, you can see an example of these brought together in this new amalgamation, adapting the original Metroid structure into a more non-linear design. Aside from their original titles, Nintendo also approached these various developers with smart licensing deals, with classic conversions of games like Capcom's Street Fighter II, designed by Yoko Shimomura. Now, this game, importantly, almost single-handedly revived the arcade industry with a new complexity and flair that it added to two-player fighting games with hard-to-execute special moves and a very colorful roster of figures from around the globe. Now, the SNES captured the arcade game's feel and followed several updates. Of course, everyone remembers that Street Fighter II Turbo being the best. Now, Nintendo had a victory here with third-party publishers and signed exclusive deals, which delayed the release of titles like Street Fighter II on Sega. There are many excellent titles to discuss with the SNES. One we should note began on the NES, the original Nintendo, in the Final Fantasy series, but it would be the sixth installment that brought a new level of storytelling and sophistication in a brilliantly realized steampunk world that pushed the SNES to its absolute limits. Designed by Uematsu, Final Fantasy VI, and under the direction of Squaresoft, released in 1994, we have the same turn-based battling as in the original seen here on the left, but it added a great number of customization and options, allowing players to personalize their characters as seen on the right. The thematic scope was, of course, more mature, encompassing issues as varied as sexuality and even suicide. At the same time, Sega's partnership with Electronic Arts resulted in a regular series of superb sports titles, but they also expanded into arcade versions as well for home consoles. Now, also, they're going to commission in direct competition with Nintendo exclusive deals, like Nintendo had Street Fighter II. So Sega hit back with the Streets of Rage, which was a home console version of the beat-em-up Final Fight seen here as well, which was a very popular side-scrolling arcade game by Capcom. It cloned the mechanics in the original here down to the 3 selectable characters, health regenerating food items, and temporary weapons, such as these knives that one could throw, or bats. The sequel here of Streets of Rage 2, released in 1992, far surpassed the inspiration in the arcade and added a much more complex combat system with a wider range of enemies and characters, a fantastic techno soundtrack, and the characters seen here, 4 of them, more widely differentiated as far as gender, size, and ethnicity. However, perhaps the most infamous victory in the console wars belongs to Sega with its release of Mortal Kombat in 1992. Originally designed by Ed Boon and John Tobias, we have a Street Fighter II clone, arguably, designed to attract publicity and would end each bout with a fatality, the most controversial aspect of the game, with a realistic fighting style and blood. Now, fatalities would have a player who would lose standing upright and staggering for a number of moments at the end, while the winning player could input a complex sequence of buttons in order to execute a grisly finishing move. Examples of these include a morphing dragon where your character would have been bitten in half. You could burn off their faces. You could freeze if you're Sub-Zero and then shatter their bodies. Many of these examples became infamous and, of course, would outrage parents and politicians alike. The ad campaign hit home relatively obviously that Mortal Kombat is so real it hurts. So capturing on not the cartoony aspects of violence, but the physical, visceral approach that Sega so loved to differentiate itself from Nintendo. Now, it is not as complex a game as Street Fighter, but the extreme violence and gore led to immediate success and notoriety. It became a cultural phenomenon and remains so to this day in the long-running series. Now, Nintendo insisted on toning down the gore or removing it entirely for their version that was released, conscious of their family-friendly image. So obviously, Kano would not pull out Raiden's heart with blood gushing everywhere. So here is Nintendo's version on the upper left, which of course you would find more akin to sweat or dust coming off the characters instead of blood. Now, this fed into, quite naturally, Sega's overarching marketing strategy that made Nintendo seem out of touch with its main market. Thus, Sega's version outsold the Nintendo version 2-1. Now, famously, this led to Senate hearings on the violence in video games between 1992 and 93. The key role was played by Senators Joseph Lieberman and Herb Kohl, whereby they argued in a very out-of-touch fashion that video games were subversive and could do things that obviously they could not. In fact, the argument is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what video games could and could not do. This would have, of course, been solved if the senators or anyone involved had actually played the game. It's slightly comical now to think, but resulted in a voluntary rating system for video games in the entertainment industry. The Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, is going to voluntarily put ratings on games from early childhood all the way up to mature or adults only. These can be found just like the CDs at the time in the early 90s in a very similar, very political debate. Now, given that we're in the midst of the console wars, the situation was not helped when the witnesses on behalf of Nintendo and Sega did not attempt to correct misconceptions about video games and instead spent the entire time taking potshots at one another. But perhaps the most important difference between the companies was not the amount of violence in the games, but instead their approach to hardware upgrades. Now, Nintendo would revitalize the Super Nintendo Entertainment System by introducing upgrades via cartridges, like that seen in Star Fox and the Super FX chip. Now, these cartridges would be purchased by the consumer, not included in the original hardware by the manufacturer. Now, Donkey Kong Country would also be one of these examples like Star Fox, and featured three-dimensional models and textures that are pre-rendered on SGI workstations and then converted to the SNES hardware, resulting in outstanding visuals, even compared to 32-bit gaming systems. Now, Nintendo, importantly, highlighting this difference, is going to be interested in the visual appeal of the games. And so this is going to lead to Donkey Kong Country selling 9 million copies globally. So it is a successful strategy. Alternatively, Sega adopted and then abandoned two major hardware upgrades. The first being the failed Sega Mega CD of 1992, which was a CD-ROM unit seen here on the left that was attached to the base of the Mega Drive or Genesis console. It allowed, importantly, for full motion video or FMV sequences. Now, we know that Sega believed this would be a major selling point for this unit and bought up old Laserdisc games that were never released, as previously mentioned games like Sewer Shark and Night Trap, and working on these exclusive titles such as Sonic CD. They believed this was the answer to the console wars. However, the games are very underwhelming and they fracture the audience. If one plays Sewer Shark, for instance, the engagement with the game is quite limited because once you accomplish something, such as shooting an object or sprite, you then have a cutaway scene that you have no control over. Now, Sega then does something disastrous a second time. They learned nothing from the experience of the Mega CD. Instead, they launched the 32X in 1994, which was an add-on, seen here plugged into the top, designed to bridge the gap between the Sega Genesis and the upcoming 32-bit generation of consoles. This would allow Sega more time to perfect the troubled design of the upcoming Sega Saturn. Virtua Fighter would be the best game for the 32X, but mostly it played host to barely any games in its library, and pretty much enhanced existing games, much like Super Nintendo did for the original Nintendo games. So shortly after it is released, just like the Mega CD, it was abandoned. So twice in a row, we have Sega launching new hardware systems that consumers would buy and then they would not support. So Sega was a household name at the time when they made this disastrous decision. With 55% of the American market share, they were beating Nintendo. But after these failed hardware releases, the abandonment shook consumer confidence in Sega and they began to decline. In the end, the Super Nintendo would sell 49 million consoles worldwide versus 40 million for Sega. Now, this doesn't sound like much, but compared to the previous generation, this is a great victory for Sega, and they saw it as such. We should note, however, that the original NES sold 62 million units total in its run. So they supported that, and it was a smart decision as long as they could before releasing the SNES. Now, both companies believed they had won the war in the 16-bit console aspects of it, and they prepared for more of the same. But little did they know there was a new challenger that would undermine both of them and dethrone them. Before we talk about that new challenger, we need to discuss the evolution of 32-bit generation games that begins with two obvious failures. The first is by Atari, who in the mid-1990s is an unrecognizable entity compared to the industry-defining company it had been in the 1970s. Now, the Atari Jaguar in 1993 was marketed as the first 64-bit gaming system developed by external talent common for Atari, Flare Technology. Now, this was after the failure of the Lynx, the handheld device that we will discuss in the class specifically on handhelds here soon. So they turned their attentions instead to the Jaguar. It was a priority at the time that, as Atari saw it, the Jaguar made it to market as quickly as possible. They hoped to lure away consumers from the very popular SNES and Sega duopoly, or the two companies that controlled the market at the time. It launched in 1993 for $249, much higher, nearly twice as much as the original Sega price, and has with it arguably the most bizarre controller in video gaming history. A large plate-shaped plastic mold with a standard D-pad on the left with 3 buttons on the right. The top half, that's what we have with these buttons, along with a 12-button switchboard on the bottom half. It was a very powerful machine, but the CPU had issues. Because of the lack of documentation associated with it, most developers declined to create games for the Atari Jaguar. And by 1996, it had sold only 125,000 units and would virtually bankrupt Atari. There are a few decent games to note, such as their versions of Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. However, the most original game and the highest selling one for the Jaguar would come from Rebellion Developments, released in 1994, and that is Alien vs. Predator. And it is a very original take on the first-person shooters that we discussed. In the game, you can play either the role of an alien, a predator, or a colonial marine, each of which has different abilities, objectives, and unique user interfaces. So obviously, if you're the predator, as seen here, you can choose from the weapons at your disposal and move through the game in a different fashion than, say, a colonial marine on the left, or once again, an alien that we have here. Now, it is a game that is as much a horror game as a shooter, and is by far and away the best-selling game for Jaguar. Another very original game is Tempest 2000, designed by Jeff Minter and released in 1994. Now, the original version of this was a vector-based shooter game full of bright colors, neat perspective tricks, and it was extremely fast. The updated version increases all of these elements by adding very trippy special effects, a warping background, and blasting techno music. The fitting follow-up, as seen here, would be appropriate. On the left, you can see the original one by Dave Thurer. On the left here, you can see the new version. On the right, you can see the original and the updated visuals and how spectacular they are, which is being rebooted again, in case anyone wants to go play that. This brings Atari's early creative activities full circle. So they go out not with a whimper, but instead with a bang with this last set of original software and hardware releases. Now, the Jaguar was, of course, going to have an ill-fated end because the hardware was too expensive and there were issues with the CPU and there were not enough quality titles. At the same time, we have its ill-fated contemporary, the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, which is released by Panasonic in 1993, also failed. Now, the 3DO was a console conceived by Electronic Arts founder Trip Hawkins. Now, it did sell 2 million units, so despite being considered a commercial failure, it did, once again, achieve some bit of notoriety and paved the way for another release we'll talk about in a moment. But it lacked software for a very important reason. The idea behind the 3DO that Hawkins had was a unified platform that could be manufactured by any licensee. Hence, we have a much lower royalty when it comes to the rates on software than contemporary home consoles like Sega or Nintendo that charge developers quite a bit. The business model, however, depended on large electronic companies licensing and selling the 3DO hardware, which is more important. So, of course, they courted Sony and Panasonic and many others. Sony was already working on its own version that we'll discuss here in a moment, but Panasonic signed up. The problem was the price. The price was nearly 3 or 4 times that of other consoles of the day at $699. They almost immediately dropped it to $599 to make up for this, and we find that retailers balked at the price. They would not even carry this particular system. So the upfront cost, combined with a lack of truly must-have games, sealed the 3DO's fate. And it was discontinued after 3 years in 1996, almost as short-lived as Atari's Jaguar. With the ill-fated release of these last two systems, we have a story of success that would have gone very differently with the rise of PlayStation beginning in 1990. Now, PlayStation would not have existed had Nintendo stuck to the original deal. The story is as follows. Nintendo considered a response to Sega's Mega CD approaching Sony about a partnership. The original idea was that Nintendo would sell the add-on for the system, while Sony would sell an integrated unit called the PlayStation, hence the Nintendo PlayStation. Now, Sony's engineers, led by Tsurakaji, felt that video games were not progressing fast enough, and he wanted especially a real-time 3D game system. But at the time, Sony CEO Norio Oga did not want to get into what he called the toy business. This would all change when Nintendo had second thoughts. Now, they had at this time been used to controlling all aspects of the business, so the design and manufacturing rights under this contract would have been left to Sony. So Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo at the time, decided to pull out of the deal with Sony and offered it instead to Sony's arch-rival Philips to make an alternative product that would do the same thing. But Yamauchi did not tell Sony. It was, at this time in 1991, at the Consumer Electronics Show that Kutaragi proudly announced the Nintendo PlayStation, seen here on the right. Nintendo immediately announced that it would not be partnering with Sony, but instead with Philips. Humiliated in front of the world's press, Oga, enraged and felt this was tantamount to betrayal, was approached by Kutaragi, who was also furious, but used this opportunity to press Oga on the future of video games and Sony. He explained that now, after they had developed this PlayStation, Sony had the expertise, the global reach, and the resources to become a major force in the video game industry, thus striking a blow back at Nintendo. Very famously, Oga then turns to his young developer and says, "Do it." Now, we find that they waited very smartly until the next generation to make the debut of the PlayStation to capitalize on CD-ROM technology. Kutaragi is going to design the CPU for the machine himself, and as he wanted, he focused on real-time 3D graphics and speed. Sony had also observed its competitors very closely and waited for its time. It noted how the 3DO's biggest failure was a lack of software. So Sony at this time went on a global charm offensive with developers and publishers. Now, many of them at the time were wary of the cost associated with CD-ROM development and 3D games in particular, because most were familiar with 2D game development. It would be, ironically, the success of Sega's Virtua Fighter in 1993 that turned the perceptions in the industry around that this could be done. Now, the Virtua Fighter, it must be remembered, used these constructed forms of three-dimensional polygons that demonstrated three-dimensional viability, both technically and for the underlying game, that could be well designed as any 2D game. A crucial part of the success of Sony was this creation of a massive software library and a set of tools for all developers to use, such as common functions like saving, which could be plugged into each game. We find here that Okamoto, who's going to develop this library under Kutaragi's direction, compared the process to a car factory, in which you would use the same screws in different places, but you're still making cars. Now, at this time, they would have had at the end over 250 studios committed to developing games before even launching the PSX, as it is known, or PS1 in America. Now, they began buying up pre-established global studios. Psygnosis, for instance, would then become Sony Interactive Entertainment and form the core of this new development arm of Sony. Now, they initially encouraged comparisons with Sega in early advertising, and this versus narrative they believed would keep PlayStation in the news, and it worked. Sega was entirely caught off guard at the time. Development for its Saturn was delayed, and so originally the Saturn was meant to be the ultimate 2D machine, much like the SNES in its original conception. So it did not compare to the PlayStation's capabilities with three-dimensional visuals. So there was a last-minute redesign that Sega was forced to do with the Saturn that ultimately turned out to be a botched job. The CPU in the Saturn lacked the strength to perform these complex calculations that three-dimensional visuals required, so Sega simply added another CPU. Now, this meant that the internals of the system were a mess of wires and connections, which also meant that it was more expensive to make and assemble than the PlayStation, which of course invites a price war. The Sega Saturn was launched officially in Japan in 1994 and shipped 200,000 units that sold out on the first day. Now, this was largely thanks to the Arcade Perfect port or version of Virtua Fighter. Now, initially, it must be remembered that the Saturn outperformed the PlayStation, but it quickly ran out of steam. 3 months after PlayStation's launch, Sony sold more than 1 million units. So therefore, we can see that the Saturn was quickly eclipsed. Nintendo's Yamauchi, in fact, had vowed to resign if Sony had ever sold more than 300,000 units. No one seemed to take him up on this when, of course, 1 million units were sold, and he had to eat his words. The Saturn was starved of non-Sega software and had already peaked. Therefore, Sony, in order to undercut the competition, reduced its price by $100. Sega, in turn, did the same, and this would go back and forth and continue until 1998, when Sega was forced to stop the price cutting and write off its American losses at $4.3 billion. The most iconic moment of the rivalry between Sega and PlayStation would be at the American launch of both consoles at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, in 1995. It was at this time that Saturn went first, announcing that it would sell for $399, including the very popular Virtua Fighter. The Sony representative then took the stage and merely said $299 and walked off, and there was huge applause. Sega was, of course, dumbfounded. So the Sega marketing team built the concept and selling point of Sega around the idea that it was cool. Sony had a much more profound marketing strategy. They targeted young adults who grew up playing games. Thus, they had lifestyle marketing and would go out into clubs and venues and leave pamphlets and demos. Now, the best example of the distinction between the two developers would be in the Tomb Raider series. As one of the most iconic games associated with PlayStation, it is interesting to note that Tomb Raider first launched on the Saturn. Sony recognized that core design had developed a great game, with the character of Lara Croft having great mainstream media potential and appeal. You have this tough, sexy female adventurer in the Indiana Jones mold, who was very distinct from the gruff Marines or cartoony mascots associated at that time with video games. Now, most of the attention paid in this particular instance of the character is to Lara's sex appeal, who is going to be considered, and there has been much scholarship published on her character, as either a feminist icon or a chauvinist stereotype masquerading as such. Still, it is one of the video game's most recognizable heroes. The innovative focus with the Sony release is on the environments instead of combat. Here we have a new way to play three-dimensional environments in which patient inspection of the surroundings is what rewards players instead of blazing through or beating up opponents. It is built around simply negotiating huge levels for the time, mastering Laura's capabilities, in which he can run so fast or jump so far or learn what surfaces she can grab onto. Now, the lack of allies and the infrequent contact Laura has with human enemies creates this type of loneliness for the game. Now, there are major moments that stick in the mind showing how iconic Tomb Raider is. For at the start of the third area, a gigantic T-Rex bursts on the scene and becomes one of the most memorable moments of the PlayStation era. It is the first of a new breed of three-dimensional adventures and would be a defining influence on contemporary series such as Uncharted. Sega also had exclusives of its own, but couldn't compete with the mainstream awareness of Sony. A great example of that is the Panzer Dragoon series. Originally released in 1995, it is a rail shooter where the player is going to be a dragon-riding hunter. Here we find that it is improved upon in multiple versions here, whereby later in Panzer Dragoon Spy or Panzer Dragoon Saga, you can morph into a dragon. There are many different new add-ons and additions that make the rail shooter more enjoyable and can be played multiple times. But it came at the end of the life of the Sega Saturn, and so with such limited quantities and once again little known, did not receive the recognition as its competitors, so it remains rather a lost classic. Other titles demonstrate Sega's originality, such as the spiritual successor to Golden Axe, Guardian Heroes, developed by Treasure in 1996. Now, it improves upon the original Golden Axe series immeasurably, with innovations that include composing the battlefield of 3 planes that could be switched at will, so the player always knew when the enemy was lined up with them. The RPG-like leveling system, combined with the multiple story paths, create a very stiff challenge with games like Guardian Heroes. Now, Sega, unfortunately, despite these original ideas, had no way to address the changing audience Sony had tapped into, and this is one of the major failures on the part of Sega. For instance, it couldn't develop a Sonic title for the Saturn. Now, Nintendo's Super Mario 64, that we'll discuss in a moment, had set such a high bar that the development on Sonic Extreme took an extended amount of time. It was given to Sega Technical Institute, who worked on the concept, and they did develop an innovative fisheye lens that bent the surroundings at the edges and allowed the player to see more of the level while focusing still on Sonic. However, there were internal factions in Sega that led to its cancellation in 1997 and is often cited as the reason for the Saturn's failure the following year. But, as mentioned, there were multiple issues that led to this. While failing to develop the Sonic version for the Saturn, the team did come up with many very original games like Nights into Dreams of 1995, in which we have a 2-dimensional game on 3-dimensional backgrounds. It is built around the concept of simply enjoying flying. Initially, the player controls one of 2 children who are dreaming, but are troubled by nightmare manifestations of their insecurities. They search for and find a jester-like character called Knights, who soars into the air, flying a predetermined route around each nightmare, and can use boosts, grab onto other characters, and perform acrobatic moves as the stars trail in its wake. A combo system encourages players to fly quicker and use as many stunts as possible. A strict timer counts down to the moment Knights is given to one's control. So if Sonic was about speed, Nights into Dreams is about momentum. Now, when it ends, you come back down to Earth as one of the children. The final stage, arguably the most original, is going to be a flat miniaturized version of the children's hometown, Twin Seeds. And we find that Night is now missing. You search for this character and cannot find it. But Night, we find out, is no longer required for the children to fly. The magical twist at the end is actually communicated through the player's own choice, whereby you have to walk to a ledge and jump off. It is so original when you realize you can fly at that point without this character that it has never been copied since. But of course, it is too singular an idea to bring commercial success to Sega. While Sega had difficulty with mainstream success, the opposite was true of Sony, who had a PlayStation library with more mainstream appeal. And the reason for this is it had a simple license fee of just $10 per game. In the end, Sony would have 2,418 officially licensed games. This is the main nail in Saturn's coffin, its lack of developers. Now, because we have over 2,000 titles here, a comprehensive overview is impossible. We should focus on a few key examples that will be influential later. The early success of Sony is also keyed into and tied to the developer Namco, who would come up with titles like Ridge Racer and Tekken in 1994, which were launch titles that went along with PlayStation. Now, we find that Ridge Racer is inspired by Outrun, a fast and furious arcade racing game seen in the lower right-hand corner here. It is endlessly replayable thanks to its take on drifting and higher difficulty modes. Ridge Racer is impressive due to the three-dimensional polygon visuals previously seen only in arcades that established the power of the PlayStation, showcasing what the hardware could do. It is criticized quite often for offering an arcade rather than a home experience. This criticism is then addressed in Ridge Racer Revolution, the sequel, which amped up everything. The whole world becomes brighter, and there are new challenges, such as the spinning point, where you can spin in the air as a racer. Now, this showed that Sony understood what players actually enjoyed doing in its refinements. Namco's answer to Virtua Fighter and the pair to Ridge Racer would be Tekken. Now, the focus here on Tekken was on button mashing combos and allowing fighters to move spectacularly regardless of what the player does. Therefore, it's more enjoyable to a mainstream audience than the earlier Virtua Fighter or even Street Fighter. Now, it deliberately moved away from the audience of Street Fighter, who were happy to memorize long combinations of or sequences of moves and precise timings. Instead, Tekken, in its series, appealed instead to those that wanted to virtually beat up their friends in two-player mode. Now, there's no single title that defined PlayStation, but one of the more important games for the console's image would be Psygnosis' Wipeout of 1995. Now, it's an F-Zero inspired racing game developed by Psygnosis, which was super fast and precise in its futuristic racer theme. Obviously, you see down here F-Zero in the lower right-hand corner and Wipeout at the left. It is a very difficult game, importantly, to master. But interestingly enough, the game wasn't important. What was important here was the box and the advertising campaign that went along with it, as well as the soundtrack chosen, which included tracks from Left Field, The Chemical Brothers, and Orbital. Now, Sony and Psygnosis smartly also crafted the game's reputation and had it included in the film Hackers. Along with the overt associations with the drug ecstasy, they did try to target a particular audience and made the appeal of the game and the wowness factor associated with PlayStation all the more evident in a mainstream fashion. Now, we find here that Wipeout had style, but a revolutionary driving game still was going to take longer to develop. The team, in fact, that would create Motor Toon Grand Prix in 1994, which was an impressive Mario Kart clone, simultaneously was working on a more ambitious project since 1992. They sought to create the most realistic driving game possible. This would come in the form of Gran Turismo, released in 1997, and was such a leap forward for racers. It created its own genre of hyper-realistic driving games that included everything down to the tire choice and engine tuning that would affect your success as a racer. It was more akin, actually, to a simulation than ever before, if we think back to the simulations for the Army of firing a tank or a flight simulator. It recreates more than any game before it the feeling of driving in an unmatched manner. Now, one of the best cinematic platformers ever made, and another one of the examples of a unique title, would have been Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey of 1997, the same year as Gran Turismo. Now, it used pre-rendered backdrops to bring the grim world of Rupture Farms to life. Now, Abe, the main character that you play, is a Mudokan, or factory slave, that learns that his species is the next to be turned into food, thus resolving to escape. The mechanics in the game are clever, for the world is a special dark parody of our own meat-obsessed consumerism, with blood-caked treadmills, festering corners, which provide more than the story does of any cutscene. Now, the beginnings of the series of Grand Theft Auto are also significant. We should briefly mention the first release here by Rockstar in 1997, which originally, if you think back, was a fun top-down game that crossed a driving game with a shooting game. Now, it was originally called Race and Chase, which tells you a lot about the original intention that's infused in the spirit in the next three titles. And that is a kind of knockabout, fun kind of game that is not meant to be as serious. Now, to say the original game is a classic is a bit of a stretch if you go back and replay it. You are thinking of the more recent Grand Theft Autos and the more spectacular experiences associated with them where you can go anywhere and do anything. But hints of the greatness of the Grand Theft Auto franchise can be seen in the original, especially in the sprawling city itself, that was waiting after this development for its own 3D moment. It still felt like a 2D game. Speaking of early three-dimensional titles and standouts, we should mention Capcom's Resident Evil, released in 1996. Now, it also used pre-rendered three-dimensional backgrounds and a fixed camera angle. Now, it was sold and termed a survival horror game and would spawn the most successful franchise in Capcom's history. In the game, you can play as either Chris or Jill. Now, the game specialized in jump scares, forcing the player to carefully manage their resources, making their way through this mansion setting, which was in fact the real star of Resident Evil. Now, the vision here of the mansion was one of faded opulence that held sinister secrets and made the game so appealing and intriguing. Now, the poor voice acting does undo a lot of the atmosphere at times, but it's crafting a potent mix of fear and claustrophobia that began the successful series, the most successful in Capcom's history, and of course led to many sequels as well as motion pictures. The beneficial side effect of Sony's decision to use CD-ROM technology as a storage medium would attract many previous Nintendo stalwarts such as Squaresoft to their platform. Now, here we have Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997, and it was the defining entry in the world's grandest RPG series. The scope and complexity were impressive and immense. It was an enormous world filled with distractions as you move through it. Now, it was still a turn-based battling system, much like Dungeons & Dragons and the early Final Fantasies, but it was given a metagame in the form of the Materia system, whereby it opens up characters and allows them to pursue whatever expertise the player wants, instead of locking them into upgrading in a particular area. The series follows this one with the adventure of these eco-warriors that battle to save the world from resource-stripping corporations. Now, the message, of course, here is clear of anti-consumerism and anti-capitalism, but there is a new level of ambition associated with Final Fantasy VII. It had a $45 million production budget and a $100 million US marketing budget. Now, it is cited as the first RPG to crack the Western market, but obviously it had a lot of help. A great deal of resources were put behind this title. Now here we have the fetish for cinematography as opposed to cinematic experiences taking hold, with the selling point of these cutscenes. For instance, the most iconic moment in Final Fantasy VII is the death of Eris, which occurs in a non-interactive cutscene. So the separation of the main narrative from the game's body with its big budget ad campaign based on non-playable CG footage meant that Final Fantasy VII was a watershed moment for these types of cinematic experiences. The genius concept, of course, was to make an RPG with deep systems that Squaresoft had always done, but sell it as an action movie. So over 10 million copies because of this were sold, and it is the precursor of the golden age for Squaresoft and the PlayStation, with a series that follows it known till this day, such as Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy VIII, The Vagrant Story, Xenogears, and Ergeiz. While the battle between Sega and Sony raged, Nintendo's successor to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, faced familiar problems that we've been discussing. The SNES was enormously profitable, and just like the NES, Nintendo continued to support it well into the PlayStation era. And with the launch of the successor, it would be well after the competition had been established. Nintendo's successor was codenamed Project Reality. It was called Project Reality because of the belief that a 64-bit processor was capable of producing such high-quality three-dimensional visuals that it would surpass anything the competitors could dream up. Now, this was based on a real-time 3D graphics chipset that was designed by Silicon Graphics. Now, the most controversial decision that was associated with the Nintendo 64, released in 1996, was to stick with the game cartridges over the new CD-ROM technology that the PlayStation was using. Developers were horrified at this point that they wouldn't have access to the ample storage and audio quality made possible by the new format. Now, this is an important philosophy that carries through Nintendo's history, in that it's the experience of the players that is the highest priority. And that was believed that Nintendo stated that the experience without loading times made possible with the cartridges instead of the CD-ROM would be better for the player. Now, we also can see this in the controller for the Nintendo 64, which looks awkward. It's a three-pronged hunk of gray plastic with an analog stick in the middle, a giant shoulder buttons, and an underside trigger, the Z trigger. But if you hold it, it actually feels better in the hands than the renowned PlayStation pad. The 4 controller slots also is an innovation that allowed for a 4-player split screen feature, which people remember to this day. It launched, actually delayed from its initial launch from 1995 in order to perfect the game that was supposed to launch with it, Super Mario 64, and Miyamoto was right to delay, giving his team enough time to have this pack-in title ready, because it is arguably one of the best games ever made. Now, it started not with Mario, as with many developers who would begin with the character and then create the world around it, but instead it started with a cuboid form that had the 3D world then built around that. We didn't even have Mario in the outset. The idea was it had to be fun simply to move him around first before developing anything. Then, once again, they developed Mips, the rabbit, which really was just a sprite that would hop around quickly and was fun to chase. It let the team study camera angles, momentum, character animations, and it was cartoony but had consistent physics associated with it. So this is very important for the success of Nintendo 64. It starts from first principles and questioned many of the basic guidelines and premises of earlier games, such as why must there be a fixed endpoint to a game going from one to the next? Why do we have to move from one level to the next in a linear progression? Why does one have to finish all the levels in order to finish the game? Therefore, Super Mario 64 introduced a hub structure, which Princess Peach's castle was in the center and was one of the largest levels, full of paintings, crannies, extensive basement, countless rooms, and many more secrets. It starts by introducing the player to the controls, by simply understanding the joy of making Mario run, jump, and climb and interact with his environment. Now, the world is accessed through a brilliant conceit, much like Super Mario 3 of Theater. Now you're jumping through paintings to enter different worlds, as seen here on the right. The first world, which was Bob-omb Field, we have a twisting hill at the center that spills down into a huge open space, while cannons fire at Mario. Mysterious floating islands are there to explore, while gigantic balls roll down the hills. Goombas are waddling around, and there are posts to hammer into the ground. It is packed with brief flourishes, such as a half-pipe filled with swerving cannonballs, and full of details that have nothing to do with the challenges necessarily, but are fun flourishes. Now, Super Mario 64 is defined by a sense of playfulness and is central to Nintendo. The title screen, for instance, opens with Mario's face that can be pulled out of shape and twanged back into position. There is a tiny, huge world that has two entrances of paintings. One, if you enter, you become a giant Mario, and the other, a pygmy Mario. In the castle's basement, another example is you find Mips, this rabbit that you chase around, and if you catch him, he gives you one of the 120 stars in the game. Now, what is interesting is the game never tells you to chase Mips. It's just fun to do. Therefore, intuitively, this is built into the system. Now, it is called the best translation of a two-dimensional series into 3 dimensions, but it is untrue, because there is nothing in the game common with two-dimensional Mario games. And it is the real beginning of 3D games here in 1996, with blazingly creative and wide-ranging generosity to boot, where there are few games that have been made in the 2 decades since that can come close to it. Now, the games are often discussed in general over the course of this class as expressions of their creators, such as the homilies of BioWar and RPG, or the anti-war message of Metal Gear. But Super Mario 64 is only a simple joy of motion, the satisfaction of discovering a secret, the pride of overcoming a challenge, and the wonder as a new world unfolds before you. Now, whereas Super Mario 64 will build this new 3D world, we turn to The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and we have this very different approach to recreating Link's world. It should be noted that this particular installation in the Zelda series has so many Best Game Ever awards that we can't count them here. It invented, very importantly for gaming moving forward, Z-targeting, named after the N64's controller trigger button. For when you clicked it, you would center the camera on a specific enemy and stay locked on and track their movements. It was perfect for 3D combat and was copied by every 3D combat game since. Now, the structure here is familiar, but the mechanics make you able to fill out into this pattern of cause and effect, much more complex than ever before. Link's inventory, for instance, is designed for experimentation. A good example of that is the hook shot, which is seen here, right? We have the hook shot is the main tool used to shoot at targets and pull Link toward them. However, it was not underwater, Link is unable to use his sword or other weapons, and so by playing around, you discover that the hookshot can be used as an underwater harpoon. The world then is graspable by a type of internal logic. The dark world idea in this version of Zelda becomes time travel, where you begin the game as a child Link, later on in life becoming adult Link, and then you can switch between them. It uses this idea of time travel as both a narrative device and a mechanic. As the child, you defeat dragons infesting a cave on Death Mountain, as an example, and you return there as an adult to find there's a single occupant who is crying, "Hear my name," and "Tremble, I am Link," and so it comes full force. Now, the most surprising aspect of this installation is the main theme of failure and persistence. For again and again and again, we see that he is set in a world that he's already failed to save. He fails to save the Deku Tree. He is blamed for the death of his friends. He cannot stop the destruction of Hyrule. So a very interesting lesson. Now, in the end, Nintendo would end this generation firmly deposed from the top of the industry. The N64 did sell 33 million units, but PlayStation would continue to be manufactured up until 2006, becoming the first console ever to sell 100 million. Saturn's good start would end in disaster with the final sales of $9.5 million. Sega quickly began work on a comeback after almost going bankrupt. But for the old guard, everything had changed. PlayStation was here to stay. Next class, we will look at the rise of other systems such as Xbox, and a new rivalry is born.